Hey guys, it's Allie. I'm going to talk about the puppets that I made for my stop motion thesis film at RIT School of Film and Animation. I went through a lot of puppets to get to these final two. And so I've learned a lot along the way. There was a lot of trial and error. There was a lot of research into what other people had done for their puppets. So we will talk about, this will be a quick overview of my puppets. I'm planning to do a series of videos in the future where I break down all the steps of making a build-up puppet. I'll actually build one with you, and we'll break it down by armature and then build up, and then we'll do the head and then the hands, and we'll break it down by parts, and I'll go into a lot more detail. This one's going to be just a real quick video where I go over the real basics of these puppets. So yeah, let's see. So I went through a number of different puppets for this thesis film. These are maybe like 7 and 8 or 8 and 9, something like that. I went through a stupid amount of puppets, actually. And most of them started out small, too small, actually. My final puppets are actually pretty big as far as stop motion puppets go. Most stop motion puppets are between 9 and 11 inches tall. These guys are 12 inches tall and just kind of large in scale in general. The puppets that I started making at first were really about this size. He's also kneeling, so he looks even smaller, but this was the original size that I was working with. But the problem is with my film, there's a lot of facial animation, particularly lip sync, and so to be working with a puppet of this size, the mouths for a puppet this size would be ridiculous to try to have to manipulate, basically. So I had this set of smaller puppets. I have one of Molly too, but it looks awful. So I ended up using them in one shot, but I went with these bigger ones that I made then anyway, because they looked a lot better. So they are about 12 inches tall. They are build-up puppets, which means that I started with an armature and I built up foam and fabric and clay and all these different materials to make the final puppets, rather than casting them in a mold. So I find build-up puppets to be like the easiest and fastest way to get into making stop motion puppets. If you're a beginner, definitely start out with build-up puppets. Doing a cast puppet is a lot more technical and difficult, and there's a lot more trial and error and lots of money down the tube. So I think it's great to start off with build-up puppets. You can certainly do a hybrid puppet that's part build-up, part cast, but we'll talk about that in the puppet videos that I do. So they're both built on a very simple wire armature. I had made armatures in the past that were very complex with lots of interlocking brass tubing, K&S tubing, so that their arms would be replaceable, and they have all these functions and everything. Because when I was reading and watching videos and everything, everybody says, prepare for your stop motion puppets to break. Prepare for them to break. They will break. But I didn't really experience that. I mean, I felt like I had it drilled into my head reading so many books and everything, but I really didn't experience that. The only thing that I think it was mostly because I was doing a student film. It's a short film, it's a student film. The total length of the film was about 4 minutes. And so I didn't really need a ball and socket armature, and I didn't really come across any breakage. The only thing that I did notice was that the necks of the puppets, particularly Molly's puppet, her neck started to get a little loose, like it didn't had the same level of resistance, and I think if I kept animating a lot more, eventually her neck might have broken, even though I had multiple wires in there, just because I was a little concerned about the weight of her head. But that was really the only thing that seemed to break for me. So anyway, a very simple wire armature served me pretty well. And then I built up foam on top of that. I built the heads separately so that I was able to bake those, because they're partly Sculpey. The hands were built separately as well, and then the feet were built pretty much onto the puppets, onto the armature itself. So I think it goes without saying that my puppets are fully posable. You can turn their heads. She has some, dirt and things on her from sitting on the ground. She has a nice little tulle skirt thing going on here, which is fun. I also had a little rig in the back to help her to sit up straight and help her to stay stabilized while I was animating her. One small note about Elliot, the Elliot puppet, is that he spends most of the film sitting and hugging his knees, really. So with the legs that he had, I wasn't happy with how he looked when he was in that position. So I ended up actually making his legs crazy long. like disproportionately long for his body, but it looks much better to me when he's in that position than they did when they were proportionate to his body. So yeah, so in general, my two puppets are pretty proportionate in terms of human proportions. My puppets are pretty proportionate. Usually your hands fall about mid-thigh or so. Her arms are a little bit longer intentionally. I wanted them to be longer because she does a lot of reaching around and things. I didn't want them to look too short when they were bent. So in general, yeah, their proportions are pretty good for pretty standard, not too stylized. Basically, his pupils fell off, but yeah, that was just one thing that I came across with him. And then I was able to, because of his costume, I was able to hide part of those legs when he was standing. And that one part where he was standing, I was able to pretty much hide those leg extensions underneath his jacket for the most part. Obviously, it doesn't look great now because I haven't really, so I did it kind of hastily. But yeah, I was able to kind of hide those leg extensions underneath his jacket. So that kind of worked. So their feet are completely latex, with tie downs that are accessible from the top or the bottom, depending on, whatever I needed at the time. They're made of latex, which I was able to color with acrylic paint. And because of that, they are fully posable. You can kind of see, one of the tie downs from the bottom there. The tie downs are also accessible from the top. Right now I have them filled in. But you are able to access those tie downs from the top as well. Both our hands are made of latex with wire armatures inside of them, so they are fully posable. Her hands here are pretty dirty because she's been handling dirt and she's been through an entire filming process, but as you can see, all of her fingers are individually posable. She can hold objects pretty well without any kind of like rigging point in the hand. It certainly helps your hands to look even more realistic to add a little bit of nail polish, but yeah, so these guys are totally posable. You can have your pinky out if she's going to take a drink. So they look a little ugly because they're pretty dirty now, but that's basically her hands. And then his are pretty much the same. They just they're mittens, so they're still posable. He can still like wrap them around a mug versus having them, flat. I made a number of hands for her especially. They both had replacement hands, but I never actually needed to use the replacements. But I'll show you like the basic process that I did for the hands. Here's a quick rundown of how I made Molly's hands. So again, these guys are latex. I have like a wire armature underneath, and then I was able to dip them in latex, like layer by layer, latex that I had colored with acrylic, and kind of build up their structure. So they're not perfect, but they look a lot better than hands that I've seen made from a mold. So I've got a bunch of reject hands here. When I first started out, I was making much smaller puppets, so these was the size of hand that I was making before. But so I made all the hands this way. I just have them hanging out on a piece of wire like this. Some of these look like crazy monster hands. I made a ton of hands, and only some of them came out looking like good enough to be used for the puppet, basically. Although it does help a lot to put nail polish on them. It makes them look a little bit more human. You can always go back then and add some like details, like some knuckles and stuff with a little bit of paint. So I got some wire that's a smaller, it's a higher gauge, but that means that it's a smaller piece of wire. So this is 26 gauge or 24 gauge, something like that. The standard armature wire that you're working with is 16 gauge. But if you're making hands, if you need fingers or something, you want something a little much thinner that you can really kind of build up. Wire is just the same as jewelry in that like the higher the number, the thinner the piece of wire. So 16 gauge is significantly thicker than 24 gauge. It's kind of like a doodle really that I sort of made with the wire. So I decided to make all the fingers connected. Some people will take individual pieces of wire for each finger and then like stick them together with epoxy putty or something, but then you have a tendency for fingers to kind of wiggle and fall out. I like to keep them all connected somewhat, and then once the epoxy putty's on there, like moving one shouldn't make the other one move. That's one thing with having things connected with an armature. especially when you're making an armature for a puppet, you don't want to move one arm and it automatically moves the other one because they're both connected on the inside. But so the next thing is to like attach the hand to the wire and simultaneously make a bit of a palm. So what I did, the type of clay that I used for that is actually, there's different types of epoxy putty. It's basically a clay that you mix part A and part B, and they harden within a certain amount of time. So this is also called Plumber's epoxy. So this actually sets, it says it sets in 15 to 20 minutes. It actually sets in like 5 minutes, I would say. But this was $7. This specific brand I got on Amazon for about $7. And so it's a special type of clay. It comes in a tube like this. And if you open it up and you look inside, you've got, so it's a little bit smushed now, but you've got like a core that's black, and then there's gray, like a silver gray around that black core. So that's most epoxies that you deal with, epoxy glue or epoxy putty. It comes in part A and part B, 2 parts, and generally you have to mix equal amounts of both for the chemical reaction to happen. So you've got part A and part B, they're just all together already. So one of them is the black and one of them is the gray. And yes, they're actually touching each other right now, but it's not until they're mixed that the chemical thing will actually happen. So you really you just slice off a slice of this just like you do with those rolls of cookie dough. You probably should wear gloves when you're doing this, but I don't know, I'm not always the safest person. So I'm mixing it up here. So I split it into 2 bits here. I kind of insert the wire into the palm there as best as I can, and then I kind of sandwich those 2 parts of epoxy putty. So I'm like connecting what is the forearm and the palm of the puppet at the same time, and trying to like squish that nice and flat. Yeah, so then I'll set it aside, and within, 5 minutes or so, it should be nice and hard like this one. If you want to have a really flexible palm, you could do it in parts and then leave some of the wire exposed so that the palm is able to like flex more. But basically that's just how I did it. And then I was able to find this type of latex. It's called Mold Builder. So I'm a big fan of latex. I work with latex as an undergrad. And so I happened upon Mold Builder, which is significantly thicker than any latex I've ever come across. The nice thing with latex, with silicone you have to have the special dyes and things to color it. With latex you can just use acrylic paint, which is standard, really cheap paint you can get for like 50 cents at Walmart. So it smells awful. Latex in general smells awful. There's only a little bit left in here, but I had this whole thing of latex and I put a bunch of acrylic paint in there till it was like skin colored, the exact skin color that I needed for Molly. And then I was literally able to dip the hand in and kind of like tap it off a little bit and then set it somewhere to sit. And then that would dry, and then I do another layer and another layer. And so obviously some of them come out, yeah, latex smells horrible. So some of them come out bumpy or like friggin' weird looking, but eventually you get the hang of it. You get some pretty nice hands that are then, fully posable. The only thing with latex is it doesn't last that long. Over the course of 1.5 years to 2 years or so, it'll start to degrade. But most people, you're making a puppet, you're going to use it right away. So it's not really a concern. And so their entire costuming, all the clothes I made from fabric, raw fabric that I got at Joann Fabrics. No piece of clothing here was pre-made. I put it all together myself, and I built most of it directly onto the puppet. That served my purposes a little bit better. I had to dye Molly's shirt after the fact because I stupidly chose to make her shirt white, and that's not a good color to work with when you're working with a puppet. Too much white can really reflect the lights of the set and be kind of an eyesore for the viewer. But so for the heads of both of these guys, I had a piece of wire, a strong piece of wire. I used triple twisted wire, and then especially for Molly's head, her head got very heavy, so I added on an extra wire later. So I had the piece of wire, and I built a small ball about the size of a cherry on top of that piece of wire, and I made that out of Plumber's epoxy. And then around that ball, I built up a bunch of aluminum foil to build up the size of the head that I wanted. That way you can build up mass without adding a whole lot of weight. Because one of the problems with making puppets is you don't want to make a head that's too heavy for the body to be able to hold up. But yeah, so you've got that Plumber's epoxy with the aluminum foil around it, and then I built Super Sculpey on top of that. Super Sculpey is like Sculpey, but it's just a little bit stronger, that's all. And it happens to come in a skin type color already, which is nice, even though I ended up painting their heads anyway. But so I sculpted the heads around that foil, and then I was able to put that head in the oven on its own to bake it. And then I painted it, attached hair if I had to put hair on it, and then attached it to the body from there. So I used acrylic paint to paint the heads, and then I did a coat of matte medium, acrylic matte medium, so you can use the Podge brand, that works fine. I did a coating or two of that on top of the acrylic to kind of protect the head and seal the paint in there, so that if I got anything onto the heads, it was easy to kind of wipe away instead of having to redo some of the paint job. So acrylic paint worked well for that. As I mentioned, both my puppets have magnetic eyes, so I'm able to switch out the actual eyes themselves. So she had these two guys on. So there are magnets in her head, and then there are also magnets in each of the eyes. You can kind of see in the back there's a little magnet. So I'll talk about the magnets that I use. But yeah, so if you need to make a puppet blink, this is a little cookie sheet, it's a little metal cookie sheet. So I've been using that to keep all my eyes on because they snap right to it. So if you wanted to make a blink, you could start with maybe the eyes fully open. And then when you need to do a blink, you can do, it often works really well to do one frame of half closed and then 2 frames of totally closed, because otherwise the viewer doesn't quite catch it. So 2 frames of eyes closed, and then another frame of half open, and then back to wide open. She's obviously missing a pupil here. So yeah, so that's why I use the magnets. So when I first started doing it, I had eyes that stayed there, and I was using pieces of tape basically. Like I painted the skin color onto like some masking tape and cut out little bits, and I'd put like, and it just ended up being way too annoying, and it was going to take way too long, and it was really like, I would add another eyelid on top of the skinnier eyelid, but then when I took off the big eyelid, it would take off both of them, and then the pupil would come off, and then it was just kind of a mess. So I ended up doing this. And so the eyes are also Super Sculpey. Some of them I did with the epoxy putty that I talked about, because I had to like make new ones like in the moment. But the magnets that I used, I got from this craft store. It's like it's called Dan's Crafts and Things, but it's here in Rochester, New York, upstate New York, and they sell a lot of like model train stuff and crafty stuff and whatever. So these are the magnets that I got. You definitely want to get some rare earth magnets. They're the ones that are the strongest, especially per their size. They definitely package these as if they're like radioactive, but I guess they're so strong and they pose a harm. There's a risk for anybody that has like a pacemaker or something, some kind of, it can mess those things up. So I started keeping all my magnets in here. So I've got all kinds of little magnets. But these guys that I bought, I forget what they were. They were like 15 bucks or 20 bucks or something. They are so small. That's the size of the magnets that I used. So there's a roll of them. Some of them still have clay and stuff on them because I've reused them. And so there were magnets already in the face. And so, and the face was all painted and everything ready to go. And so since I know that magnets sometimes like to match up to each other, not necessarily lined up perfectly as you'd like them to, I allowed for that. So I put a piece of saran wrap over it, dropped a magnet in there, and let the magnet go wherever it wanted to line up. And then I rolled out a slab of clay of Super Sculpey, and I used the cap of a Sharpie to cut out little discs, because I wanted to make sure each little piece of clay that I used to make an eye was exactly the same amount of clay that I used to make the last eye, so that I could more easily make them uniform. And then I took some of the clay that I was working with and just kind of like worked it until it was about the shape that I wanted it to be. I had a little drawing in pencil on the face itself, so I could try to make sure that all my eyes were about the same size. So I just kind of patted it down in there, and then I was able to take the saran wrap, lift it up, and there I've got the eye with the magnet already perfectly placed. And so then I could slowly kind of like pull the saran wrap away and go bake this eye. And then once it comes back, sometimes the magnets will pop out during baking, but you can kind of just glue them back in there, that's fine. And then, you know, when you come back, you've got an eye that, okay, I put that in upside down. But you've got an eye that fits perfectly into that eye socket. And I try to keep track of which ones are the right eye and which ones are the left eye. So all the right eyes have these little nail polish codes on them so that I would know which is right eye, which is left eye. And then all of them also had a little dash mark on them showing where the top of the eye is. So I have it rotated correctly. So I've got this little dash here telling me that it goes in like that. So that's all the eyes. And when I made the eyes, I used nail polish. White nail polish was really nice to give me this really smooth, glossy, glassy kind of surface. That's exactly what I wanted for an eye. So most of them I did a base coat or two of that white. And then I slowly built up some acrylic paint as like the eyelids, and then added some little eyelashes. And so as far as the pupils go, all the pupils are made of paper. So I got this set, I got a set of hole punches in different sizes. And so I punched out a bunch of different black and brown and all these different colors in all these different sizes, and I tested around to see which ones looked best with which eyes. Fun fact, the size of her pupils actually changes somewhat depending on which eye she's wearing at the time. But yeah, so I was able to use those different hole punches because originally I was cutting the holes, I was cutting the dots out by hand, but like in close-up shots you could tell that I was cutting it by hand. It wasn't a perfect circle. So I went and I got the hole punches, so I would have like some really nice perfect circles quite easily. So these are all paper, and again, they're just attached with a little bit of Vaseline. It's actually kind of nice to use the Vaseline for eyes because the white of an eye is actually pretty moist, actually. Like, so using the Vaseline, it's kind of makes it look even more realistic, basically. So yeah, and so Elliot's eyes are over here. His are much smaller. The eyebrows were made of Sculpey, so I'm able to like sculpt those as I actually animate the figure. So my thesis film has a good amount of lip sync in it, and I decided after doing some research and whatnot to go with paper mouths for my puppets because I felt it looked the cleanest. I just wanted something that looked really clean. I've seen people on their own try to do replaceable mouths, replaceable jaws, and it just didn't look nearly as clean as I wanted it to look. And so the aesthetic of the mouths doesn't necessarily match with the face of the puppets too much, but this is just what I had to end up doing. So these are all my little mouths that I have cut out. They're all real tiny, obviously. I ended up painting them onto rice paper, which, like I mentioned before, computer paper. At first I painted them and I photocopied it and printed out a bunch of pieces of, computer paper. And I thought that would be a great way to be able to remake mouths really easily. But the computer paper was kind of pulling up at the sides. It wasn't wanting to lay flat on the puppet's face. So I switched over to using rice paper, which I didn't print on. These are all just hand painted onto rice paper. So rice paper is like, it's almost, you can kind of hear it. It's almost like tissue paper. It's very thin. But I really didn't have any trouble with it ripping or anything. I was very careful with it anyway. So yeah, so I used rice paper and did a bunch of different mouths of different shapes and types. There's a video by Crambushers where he talks about lip sync, and he has you do like a full thing like this. So you have your set of shapes, and then you want to make your shapes in between, going from one vowel to another vowel. This ended up being a bit excessive. Really, all the mouths that I made and cut out, I only ended up using about 15 or so. There were a solid set of ones that I pretty much just kept using over and over again. I tried to keep my mouths pretty low-key looking. I didn't want a whole lot of mouths with big tongues and big teeth and that kind of flashy stuff. I tried to keep them mostly, just small black shapes. And I had seen videos where people use repositionable glue sticks to attach mouths on, but that didn't really work for me. And then you ended up with this gunk of like this used glue that got dirt on it, and it was like sticky. It just didn't work out for me. So I ended up just using Vaseline. And so, yeah, so you just get Vaseline. You get a paintbrush that you don't care about because you're not going to get the Vaseline off it ever. And you literally just, where did Molly go? Here she is. So yeah, so her mouth is just a paper mouth. So put a little bit of Vaseline on the face, try to make the part of the face that the mouth is going to go on, try to make that flat if you can. And then you can put a little bit of Vaseline on the mouth, and then line it up. And if you're using dragon frame, you can use the onion skin to make sure that you line it up just, you know, in line with the previous mouth. So yeah, it takes forever. Yeah, you can kind of see. It takes forever, but it just looked nicer to me. I liked it that way. Another option is you animate the characters without mouths and then come in later and draw in mouths 2D in like TV Paint. So in terms of hair, his hair I made hard. It's just clay. It's some of the Super Sculpey that I put down on the table and went at with a little wire brush to kind of get that texture. And then I just attached it onto his head and baked it and then painted it and everything. Partly with him, I wanted to make sure that his hair wasn't moving around too much. There's a phenomenon with stop motion where if a character is really fuzzy or they have hair that's very easily movable, you end up with boiling, which is something that happens. That sometimes, you know, every time you touch the puppet, you move the fur or the hair a little bit, and then when you watch the footage, it looks like the hair's boiling. It's like moving around all over the place. So if you look at some of Wes Anderson's stop motion films, you'll definitely see examples of boiling there. He was aware that was going to happen, and he made the choice that he didn't mind, from what I hear, from what I've read. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's an aesthetic choice, definitely, on his part. But that's a good example if you want to check out Fantastic Mr. Fox or Isle of Dogs. You'll see fur on the puppets actually moving around a little bit, almost like the wind's blowing or something. And so for her hair, this is just doll hair that I was able to get online. And again, because of that boiling concern, I was going to use Elmer's glue to solidify the hair to make it hard. It's actually pretty hard around here. But the Elmer's glue seemed to be leaving a little bit of a residue. I tried combing silicone into her hair as Leica did with the Coraline movie. With Coraline movie and then also with Kubo and the Two Strings, they did a number of different things with silicone and hair. But I ended up just using gloss medium, which is, again, you can use Mod Podge. It's just like an acrylic gloss medium that I mixed. I put the hair down, and then I just brushed in a lot of medium and let it dry, and so that way I have what looks like hair, and it is hair, but it's hard. It doesn't move around when I touch her head. So the hair that I ended up getting for my Molly puppet is some pretty standard doll hair. So it's plastic. It's like nylon or some type of plastic, basically. It's not actual real human hair or animal hair. For puppets, you can use all kinds of different hair. You can use yak hair or wool or human hair or thread or yarn, or a number of different things you can pull off to look like hair, but this is just some pretty standard super cheap doll hair, and so it came like this. I just a bunch of bundles like this, and I knew that we've all had that experience of dealing with trying to glue loose feathers with white glue onto something, and like you get glue in your hands and then the feathers are stuck to your hands and it just becomes one big gluey mess. And because of that, I knew that it would have been a bad idea to cut the hair off of this this little seam here, basically. I knew that if I just went right ahead and cut all the hair off and then tried to like put it on the head somehow, it would just become a big goopy mess. So I actually, for most of the hair that I worked with, I just kept it on this little thread that it came with. And so I picked the part of the head, I started in the back, obviously, and I picked the part of the head where I wanted the hair to be fullest. And I started there, and I really just used hot glue. So just like I drew a little line for myself to follow, but like I glued it down pretty much like at a 90 degree angle to the head itself. And then as I started to go toward the center, I started to angle it a little bit more, just because I knew I wanted to give her pigtails, so I angled it a little bit. But basically the idea is that like I just, glued it down as is, like this. So if you really went rooting around in there, you'd see this seam. You can kind of paint it in afterward, but again, you weren't going to see her hair from the back, so it didn't matter all that much. Eventually, at some point, I had too much. There was just too much volume to her hair, so I had to cut it back, and so I made this. That was kind of a mistake. That was supposed to be obscured. So yeah, so for the back of the head, I really just kind of kept it on this little thread and just glued it down a little bit at a time and held it there. I didn't do like a long string of glue and just kind of stick it all on at once, because then it would be moving around a lot. So I did like maybe ½ an inch at a time or so, and let that set before I went and did the next one. And so I did kind of like a spiral pattern. Again, I started at the part of the back of the head where I wanted the hair to be the fullest. Partly I did it kind of like down here because I knew that my pigtails were going to be low pigtails, not like really high pigtails. So I started around where the core of this would be. Yeah, and then after that, it was just a matter of trying to get the hairline to look natural-ish. That's part of why I ended up with a headband here to cover over, because I had little, I have 3 different colors really going on here. And, after I put it all together, I added that gloss medium to harden the whole thing up. So it's still a little, you've still got some unhardened hair here, but that didn't really do anything. So I mixed up some paint that was the exact same color as the hair, so I was able to like help to like bridge this little gap here, try to smooth that out. And yeah, so in the hair video, I'll talk about how exactly I got this sort of like, it's pretty rough, but it's still somewhat of a hairline. But yeah, so that's how I did the hair on Molly.